Chapter 3 of The House on the Downs by Gladys Edson Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Investigations. When Mark was presented to Fazenda Lee, it seemed to him that he read in her eyes an appeal not to refer to their meeting on the Downs, and consequently he refrained from doing so. Eve chatted animatedly with him for a few minutes, and then turned away to welcome other guests, who were at that moment announced. Mark fancied that Eve was under some mental strain. Her manner was nervous, and her eyes, almost fever-bright, had faint violet lines under them. Mr. Elphick, plump and rosy in an evening suit that was too tight for him, came in with Sir Quentin's younger brother. Mark remembered Quenton Rotherdene as a silent, moody sort of fellow, something of a misogynist, in fact. He was dark, with aquiline features and somber, rather splendid brown eyes. Looking at the younger Rotherdene, Mark found it easy to credit the tale that there had been a gypsy ancestress in the family in the days of the Merry Monarch. This, too, would account for Sir Quentin's somewhat extraordinary interest in the Romany folk. At dinner, Mark met several members of the neighboring gentry, and also Sir Quentin's other protégé, the gypsy violinist, Rodney Sherrod. The latter, a typical Romany in coloring and feature, was a handsome young man of 28 or 9. Although dressed in conventional evening suit, there was a touch of the picturesque and bohemian about him. His hair was a bit long, his tie a bit flaring, and he wore a ruffled shirt. He sat on Eve's left, his dark, ardent eyes devouring her loveliness. She, however, appeared quite oblivious to him, and as far as her duties as hostess would permit, was carrying on a running fire of raillery with Lord Mostyn, a youngish, rather dissipated-looking young man, whose admiration of Eve was at once obvious and bold. Quenton Rotherdene, sitting in grim silence, was watching his young sister-in-law. Sir Quentin, gravely courteous to his guests, was also watching Eve now and again, and his gray eyes held a vague disquiet. Mr. Elphick was listening with a kind of worshipping deference to every remark made by Sir Quentin, and frequently he would peer disapprovingly over his spectacles at Eve. It was apparent that their hostess's little flirtation with Lord Mostyn was a subject for comment among the other guests. Mark, in behalf of Sir Quentin, found himself resenting Eve's behavior. He thought, moreover, that she was drinking too freely of wine. Her laughter at Mostyn's witticisms was becoming a little hysterical. Fazenda Lee was Mark's table companion, and he discovered her to be sympathetic, intelligent, and cultured. It was evident that she had a deep gratitude and affection for Sir Quentin, and that Eve's behavior distressed her because she saw that it was distressing him. While Eve was convulsed with laughter over one of Mostyn's sallies, the loud voice of a certain Mr. Blennington rang out, informing everyone that there was the deuce to pay over at the Theatre Royal in Brighton. Irene Grayle, the star and owner of the repertory company, playing there this week, had suffered a certain nervous collapse, and the performance was called off until the next night. Eve's laughter ceased. Her fevered eyes were fixed upon Blennington. Lord Mostyn also evinced interest. "Hasn't the lovely Grayle an understudy she can put on?" "As to that, I couldn't say," responded Blennington. "But there's more trouble than Irene Grayle's breakdown. Her leading man has strangely decamped. That is to say, he hasn't been seen since the morning rehearsal. A bit odd, that. You know his engagement to Irene Grayle was made public only last night." The slender stem of the wine-glass Eve was gripping snapped suddenly. She laughed again with a distinct note of hysteria. "Oh, theatrical people are always doing odd things," she remarked. "Probably they quarreled and broke off the engagement, and he went away in a funk." At that moment a footman entered with the announcement that Police Inspector Haskett from the village had called on urgent business, and would be glad if Sir Quentin could see him at once. As the baronet rose from the table, Eve permitted Lord Mostyn to fill another wineglass for her. Her hand, as she accepted it, shook, and there was a little flutter of fear in her eyes. Fazenda Lee regarded her with concern, and it seemed to Mark that the former's face had paled. The footman returned in a few minutes. Sir Quentin requested the members of the household, Mark included, to come into the library. Eve excused herself to her guests in rather pettish fashion, declaring that Police Inspector Haskett should be discharged from the force for presuming to interrupt her dinner party. Sir Quenton was standing in the center of the high wainscoted library, talking seriously with Haskett. The inspector bowed to Mark and Mr. Elphick. Sir Quenton went toward his young wife. "Eve, my dear," he said gently, "Inspector Haskett has come to report a deplorable tragedy in Rotherdene Hollow." Eve had herself in hand now. "If that is so, it is the sole province of the police, is it not?" she queried, a half-wearied, half-insolent note in her voice. "I fail to see why Inspector Haskett, you say, should interrupt a dinner party to report what can be of no possible concern to us." Haskett's gaze was on her corsage bouquet of moonflowers. "I think, your ladyship," he remarked slowly, "the ugly business I'm working on is of great concern to some person here. The gentleman who was murdered in the Hollow is known to have been on the way to call here." "Is it murder, then, Haskett?" Eve lost some of her insolence of bearing. "It's murder right enough," he assented grimly. "Does your ladyship happen to know the gentleman, name of Craddock Rayner, according to the visiting cards I found on him?" Eve made a deprecating gesture. "I never heard the name." Haskett studied the lovely, flushed face. "It's queer your ladyship shouldn't even have heard the name. Mr. Craddock Rayner was a rather well-known gentleman in these parts. At first I couldn't place him myself, although I knew I'd heard the name, but it didn't take much questioning to find out who he was." Eve held herself very erect. "Well, who was he, Haskett? The name does sound vaguely familiar, after all." "I thought it might, your ladyship. Mr. Craddock Rayner was leading man in Irene Grayle's company over at the Theatre Royal in Brighton, where I am told your ladyship had a box party last Wednesday evening and was taken suddenly faint when the first act was on." Eve gave a high-pitched little laugh. "Oh, really, Haskett? I shouldn't suppose the fact that I was silly enough to faint at a box party a week ago would have the slightest interest for a police inspector." "Well, your ladyship," responded Haskett in his slow, heavy voice, eyes still upon the bouquet of moonflowers, "I've been in communication with the Theatre Royal, and I have got a great deal of information in a short time. I know Rayner was particular to find out the name of the lady who had fainted and caused a bit of a stir during his opening speech, and when he was told who you were, he made no comment at all, said nothing, in fact. And that seems a bit odd. I know also that he received 2 letters this week, stamped with the Rotherdene village postmark, and this noon he asked the stage doorkeeper, who is a native of the village, the shortest route by motor car to the Grange, where he said he was going to call." "Haskett," said Sir Quenton sharply, "your tone and manner toward her ladyship is becoming offensive. I gathered that you wished only to inquire whether she was acquainted with this actor, and if he was coming here with the intention of calling upon her, or upon some other member of the household. Did you know Craddock Rayner, Eve?" Mark, happening to glance at Fezetta Lee, saw that her features wore something of that horror which he had observed upon them when she fled past him from the Hollow. Eve's fever-bright eyes looked steadily into her husband's. "I did not know Craddock Rayner, Quenton, or even remember his name until Haskett recalled it to me." Sir Quenton appeared immeasurably relieved. "I trust you are satisfied now, Haskett?" The inspector's expression did not signify that he was. "Of course I take her ladyship's word," he mumbled, "but I'd like to ask if anyone else here knew Rayner and expected him to call. You see, sir, I want to find out all I can about Rayner's friends and personal affairs. It is certain that he was on his way here, but turned aside into the Hollow for some reason, and was murdered there." "I understand your motives, Haskett," conceded Sir Quenton, "and recognize that you have the right to question us all. I, for one, have never before heard Rayner's name. I have no interest in theatres, and as you doubtless know, I did not attend my wife's box party on that night you make so much of. I think I can answer, too, for my cousin, Mr. Elphick. His interests, like mine, are not in theatres or theatre folk." "Bless me, no!" exclaimed Mr. Elphick. "I couldn't say when I last saw the inside of a theatre." Sir Quenton turned to the gypsy, young Sherard, who had been listening intently to it all. "Possibly, Rodney, you have run across this actor in your concert work, and invited him to call?" Rodney shook his head. "Never knew of him, sir, till the night of Lady Eve's box party. I don't fancy he acted in anything but provincial companies. Rather a barnstormer, I thought." Sir Quenton turned an affectionate smile to Fezetta Lee. "I think it is not very likely that you knew Rayner, when neither Eve nor Rodney did." Fezetta did not answer at once. The blood rose slowly over her face. Finally, she said with constraint, "I knew Craddock Rayner slightly." End of chapter 3.